I'm Bryce Butler from Access Ventures, and this is More Than Profit, a show where I talk with founders, investors, entrepreneurs, and leaders of all kinds about living and working with purpose, how they do it, and why. My guest today is Dr. Anthony Bradley, the professor of religious studies at the King's College in New York City and chair of the program in religious and theological studies. He's also the director of the Center for the Study of Human Flourishing. More than that, he's also got a PhD from Westminster Theological Seminary. He's got a master's in ethics and society from Fordham University, a master's in criminal justice from John Jay College, a master's from Covenant, and a bachelor's in biological sciences from Clemson University. His resume is impressive. He's a prolific author and a voice on many topics, things like Black and Tired, essays on race, politics, culture, and international development. Black Lives Matter, a new book that's coming out this fall. And the one we spent most of our time today talking about, Ending Overcriminalization and Mass Incarceration, Hope from Civil Society. Dr. Bradley has spent his life looking at human connection and the role of families in solving for criminal deviancy that's led to many of the problems that we see with the overcriminalization of our youth, specifically our Black youth in America. So it was good to talk to him today and start off the conversation with the motivations that drive his work.
I'm primarily interested in how people connect with each other and what happens when connection goes bad and when disconnection really gets evil. And so much of what I see in terms of our culture, the world in general, is the degradation of connection. And I'm interested in how we can reestablish that, improve that, and rescue people from not just disconnection, but disconnection that goes evil. So really, I think that's probably the sort of the subtext behind everything else that people won't probably notice, but if you are aware of that, it should help people, I hope, connect some of the dots in terms of the random sets of topics that I tend to talk about.
Yeah.
That's the subtext behind all of those.
Is there, because I imagine, well, and I know you personally, but I'm sure there's a subtext behind the subtext. Are there a couple of moments, whether it's college or even seminary or some other things where it's like, you know what, I didn't connect here, or I struggled to connect, or I felt a sense of isolation or loneliness. And so therefore this notion of connection is something that's overlooked. Is there anything in your life where that kind of drew you to this idea of connection?
Yeah, I think so much of my post middle school life has been, I think one narrative might be attempts to resolve my own sense of disconnection and trying to sort out at least my own perception, sort of self-perception, is why is it that it seems that that other people struggle with it and some are successful at it, and why is it, depending on the context, that I myself seem to be on the outside rather than on the inside of connection. Sort of beginning in, I think my high school experience is probably the most profound one, because I was sort of on the fringe. This is the 80s, right? So you had the kind of cliques of like the cool kids, the jocks, the nerd, all those. And I never really fit into any one of those particularly. And so I just sort of bounced around and never had a sort of social home. And I spent a lot of years in college really doing the same thing, kind of bouncing around these different communities, never really feeling a sense of a social home until my senior year at Clemson. And so I'm curious about my own story there. And then what happened is, as soon as I started getting involved in ministry, I discovered that I was not alone in this. And this is maybe an epidemic, especially when I started doing a lot of youth ministry while I was in seminary.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think a lot of your work, I know you kind of through church work and different things like that, but But your work kind of spans this really interesting breadth. I mean, you have a master's in criminology. You have a master's in theology. You have a PhD in theology. Talk to me about this idea of personalism, because I think one of the things that I think is really fascinating about you and your perspective on issues like mass incarceration is you really bring it back to this issue of personalism. Can you maybe define that for us and kind of talk a little bit about personalism?
Yeah, personalism is a category in Christian social thought. It should have emerged after World War I. And it's a way of thinking about public policy non-ideologically. So what we want to do in the personalist framework is to think about policies from the person up rather than from the ideology down or from the perspective down. And essentially, one way to think about it is this. Given the attributes of what it means to be human, given what it means to be a person, all of the privileges and opportunities and expectations that are associated with being a human being, one's freedom, one's intellect, one's creativity, the opportunities to love and to be loved, community connection, all of those things that make a person. How should we be thinking about policy and society and structures from the person up, from those attributes up, so that people who are made in God's image can actually live and be truly human? So it's a way of sort of humanizing how we think about public policy, rather than saying, I believe in this ideology X, Y, and I want to impose that on this community. Or I disagree with this perspective X, Y, and I want to remove it from this community. What does it mean to think about what do people actually need, and what sorts of structures, politically, economically, socially, are necessary for people to be truly human and thrive and flourish? And this emphasis on the human person is something that really captivated Martin Luther King when he was studying at Boston University, and was a major catalyst in a category for the civil rights movement. And so you would see signs during the movement that said, I am a man. And the invitation was that America should treat African Americans according to their humanity. Right. It was also very influential in Pope John Paul II's papacy, primarily, especially in the 70s and 80s within his own writing and context. And it really, this emphasis on the centrality of the human person really gave a lot of the conceptual frameworks for the pro-life movement as well, particularly coming out of the 70s and 1980s. So my interest really is, I'm interested in having sort of non-partisan, non-ideologically driven solutions to deeply troubling social questions by thinking about what people actually need, rather than simply waving a flag about one's ideology being right or wrong. So
correct me if I'm wrong then, when we look at overcriminalization, from your perspective then, it's not so much overcriminalization is the problem, it's overcriminalization is the result of bad policy, bad ideology, or ideology that's driven decision-making throughout the decades, if not centuries, that has in effect dehumanized people in society. And so therefore we're left with overflowing prison system that's just been on a skyrocket in the last 20, 30 years. Can you talk to me a little bit about can you give us a picture from your perspective? What's the history, of criminalization in America from your perspective? How, on some level, how did we get to where we are today, where we're having this conversation and you see things like the Van Jones and the second chance movements and a lot of like reactions to decriminalizing certain offenses and recognizing that the war on drugs was probably not a good thing. These ideologies, as you say, that have driven a lot of the decision making. Can you give us a picture, like a snapshot of history that's gotten us to this point?
Yeah, most people are probably not aware that our penitentiary system was created, sort of catalyzed, initiated, designed by the Quakers. So it was primarily first a Christian institution. The first penitentiary was a Quaker one, and it was an attempt to take people who had sort of broken the social contract, to put them in a place, to hold them, that they can reflect on their public offense and be restored back to community, that they might repent and be restored. That was in the early 18th century, and as we in the West, and I mean in the UK and here in the US, as we in the West divorce the sort of Christian foundation from the framework of why we would punish people, incapacitation became more of the driving force behind policing and incarceration. Now, if you look closely at American history, what you'll find is that we've used the criminal justice system and policing and incapacitation primarily to control poor people. And that's been really the anthropological issue, is that we use the state, we use policing, we use jails and prisons to manage the poor. And one of the things that we've seen over the history of this country is using criminal laws to manage poor people, and to use criminal sentencing primarily to manage poor people. And so part of my question is that why is it that we are using those mechanisms to manage the poor rather than using other institutions in civil society to help reduce criminal activity, to keep the peace, et cetera? So when you look at the history of spikes in incarceration, there's one population that we tend to focus on, and that's the poor. And what's happened in this country is that we sort of ebb and flow in terms of those lower class people that we deem to be particularly more dangerous than others. One theorist calls them sort of rabble, right? So who are the rabble in society? Well, before World War II, the rabble were sort of non-English immigrants. So if you were looking at most major cities, we had a tendency to over-police immigrant communities, right? Scots-Irish communities and Italian communities, Greek communities, Germans, Polish, et cetera. I mean, those were the sorts of communities that were policed. And what happened, this transition kind of happened in the 50s through the 60s, is that the urban areas which used to house Western European immigrants for the most part began to house African Americans. And those same communities that were over-policed, those same communities that was sort of over-managed by the criminal justice system began to over-manage and over-criminalize the new residents of those communities, which were African Americans. And then we moved into the 70s and began to see some of those spikes that sort of drove itself into the mid-1990s. And so from my perspective, if I look behind the racial discourse, what I see are real class disparities there. Because the Black middle class, for example, in the 70s and 80s, were no less punitive than sort of white suburban decision makers in major metro areas as well. So we have this contempt about poor people that's really drives how we apply and even write criminal laws.
So what does a path forward look like? So I think the work that you're doing around the person up versus the ideology down, this idea of connection, what are some of the things that you're seeing that would actually move us to a place where the criminal justice system is restorative, is helpful, is part of the fabric of society that's healthy and allows for the flourishing of people? What does that look like? And are there pockets of that anywhere that you're seeing?
Absolutely. I have a couple of chapters in my book that really focus on states that are doing really good things, and also lots of nonprofits in the country that are really doing phenomenal things. And for me, the big question is, in terms of moving forward, is what do we do to prevent people from entering into the criminal justice system in the first place? Right? I don't think it's helpful to sort of talk about only restructuring the system, which needs to happen, or only working on reentry issues. But why did people commit crime in the first place, right? Why does criminal deviance even exist? And how do we keep people from being criminally deviant in a way that actually humanizes them rather than treating them like animals to be controlled?
Or statistics, numbers on some graph.
Exactly. And so if you look at the data, and this is not, it's kind of an aha moment for some people because they might not be aware of this, and for others it's going to be well duh. But if you look at the data, most of the prison population in jails and prisons in states are men. In most states, it's going to be anywhere from 93 to probably 96-7% is going to be men. What we tend to find is that men who commit crime tend to come from broken homes, and that's not race specific. So criminal deviance has a lot to do with the family and the ways in which boys are nurtured by their fathers. And so much of the interventions that I'm interested in are ways to strengthen institutions like marriage and family, because those are the things in the long term that undermine and destroy criminal deviance. Here's what you're not going to find usually in a prison is a man who had a father who was affectionate with him, who gave him good boundaries, who taught him virtues, who loved him deeply, spent time with him, taught him how to be a virtuous man, and included him in his relationships with his adult, peer friends. I had a mother who was very nurturing and supportive, and really introduced him into communities of adults that really loved and cared for him and invested in him. That's not the profile of a person that ends up in prison. That's the profile of a person that ends up being an entrepreneur, often ends up being certainly going to college, who is someone who becomes a man who makes a contribution to the common good. So I want to go upstream even further than changing criminal laws, further than simply thinking about reentry issues, and really undermining the existence of criminal deviance.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've talked about like this analogy of like a bathtub in some of the work that we've done, where it's overflowing and we're running around with buckets trying to hold the water at bay. And what we need to do is work to also turn off the spigot. We need to reduce the flow in. And it's not that both aren't important and we don't need to put resources in both directions, but if we can really reduce the issues, the criminal deviance, as you say, we're going to see kind of a nice community. I do have a question though, as you talk about this idea of targeting or controlling poor people. Where in the idea of criminal deviance and this idea of family, where does economics fit into that? And so it's on some levels there is a race component there, as you and I have talked about, just because of just decades, if not centuries, of unbelievable wealth inequality, because of institutions like slavery and institutions like Jim Crow. So how does the economic factor? What are those factors that you've started to identify in what keeps families together? How much of it is an economic decision? How much of it is an education decision? Like, what goes into the deconstruction of the home that we're seeing in our culture?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So much of it has to do with the sort of basic psychology of the way men think, and it's really this simple. When men have sustainable employment with a pathway and projection and expectation of advancement and opportunities to increase their knowledge and skills, they tend to get married and invest in their children. It's really just that simple. The guy needs a job, and he needs a good job. He doesn't need a super wealthy job, but he needs a good job where he can foreseeably provide for himself and for his children. Those are the things that tend to motivate men to get married. And I've always been curious about, some who say, well, they should just get married. I'm like, well, do you understand how men think? Some men won't get married because they feel inadequate about their capacity to provide for a family. Because they don't have a good job, right? And so when they have a great job, when I say great job, I don't mean simply, sweeping and picking up leaves, right? But when he has a job that's challenging, that's humanizing, he's learning and growing, those are the sorts of things that also motivates men to invest in the women they're dating, to marry them, to want to set up a family and a home. And it's not pride. I would say it's pride in the good sense of recognizing that I'm a provider, I'm a caretaker, I'm a father, I'm a husband, right? And when men don't have sustainable employment, they're less likely to see themselves that way. And what happens is that it tends to undermine their commitments to the women that they're involved with and their children. That's a really, really simple, really, really important variable that often gets missed. And I've worked with lots of working class men over the years in inner cities, and you ask them, hey, do you love her? Yes. You love these kids? Yes. And he may be living with them even, right? Well, why don't you get married? Well, I can't afford an engagement ring. What? Well, why don't you want to get married? Oh, I can't afford a wedding. What? Why don't you get married? Well, I'm kind of in between jobs and yada, yada, yada. So I think there's something about the design of men where we're being situated in a very good employment context is really the birthplace of a lot of mature decisions that tends to stabilize and maintain families.
So then let's take that into kind of the workplace. There's great resources. So like the company Cadbury, if you've studied history, which I know you're a student of history, just how they built basically a town around their company. People needed workforce housing. They built it. They provided pensions before that was even a thing. Same with Guinness, right? So there's some historic big brands. There are current day brands. There are current day companies that are really looking at this idea of making profit and providing for, and really considering the kind of the true value, the true purpose of business. What do you think happened in business to where we reduced the role of business to profit? Like the bottom line of business is money, and to maximize profit for shareholders, i.e. the investors, which is, again, I don't think we would say profit's bad, but where that becomes the only purpose. And all of a sudden the decisions you make around people, around community, around your workforce and opportunities, it starts to shift. And is there a moment or in American history or Western history where we as a culture started to kind of gravitate away from this idea of business that had other than profit purposes?
That's a fantastic question. I'm not an expert in this area to say definitively. However, my conjecture has a lot to do with our overemphasis on growth that emerged during the progressive era, where a growing business is what you wanted, right? And you want it to not have one location, but 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. And what's interesting is that as we focus on shareholder value and growth, those businesses became increasingly disconnected from their communities, as seeing themselves as members of their communities. So much of what you said is a burden for these multinational, right? So the large corp. I think most small businesses in most towns in America still see themselves that way.
Yeah.
Right. You have owner X, and she has a business, but she's also in the local Kiwanis club. She's on the PTA herself. She goes to high school football games. So her presence in her business, she's sponsoring the local Little League club. She's a member of the community. So her customers or clients are people that she sees in the grocery store. She sees them at church. She sees them, right?
Yep.
At
Little League. It humanizes their decisions.
Absolutely. But if you're in this sort of multinational company headquartered in Germany, and you're one of 500 branches across the planet Earth, you're not a member of a community. You're a member of the corp.
Yeah. You're a number on a balance sheet. And so when we've got a cost cut, boom, Detroit office closed, right. Milwaukee branch closed.
Exactly. So essentially what happens is all of those incentive structures completely change, and you swap out the incentive structures to maintain, right? To maintain good standing in the corporation, versus maintaining good standing in your community.
Yeah.
And as America's economy exploded after World War II, as we became more international in terms of business opportunities, we were really right on this growth curve, on the leverage curve, on the expanding market curve, on the curve that responded to shareholder value. The good part is that we became a very wealthy country. The other side of that coin, right? Sort of the negative externalities is greater alienation.
Yes. And
greater disconnection. Now, I am not a Marxist. I want to say this for the record. But when the Marxists talk about that, when the socialists mention that in the 19th century, in terms of the consequence of capitalism, that is, it tends to depersonalize and sort of tends toward alienation, they weren't entirely wrong about that.
Yeah. Right? Well, and that's why I think today you're seeing this emerging conversation around conscious capitalism or patient capitalism or new capitalism, just recognizing that like something happened in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, where several things occurred, right? There was the mass consolidation of businesses, globalization. So the negative externalities of that, you've got big business, big banks that are highly efficient, highly profitable, but people are reduced to statistics, balance sheet numbers. You also have economists like, one of the ones we point to a lot is Milton Friedman in the 1970s wrote a piece on that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder return, right? Mm-hmm. And so that becomes like almost law, and we kind of latch onto that, written into policy. This ideology now becomes a driver in business and how we think about markets. And it's taken a couple of decades to kind of deconstruct that a little bit and to kind of, wait a minute, profit's not the enemy, but how we make profit, how we think about people, which goes back to what you started off with, which is at the end of the day, it's all about connection. It's all about the person. It's all about where are you in community, and do you know the people you're working with and in your community, and how are you affecting change in a local, regional context? So,
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So Milton Friedman was correct. In terms of it being one of the important variables, right? If your business is not profitable, it's a signal
Sure.
that something's probably wrong, right? But it's not the only thing that matters. There are other things that matter, and I would say that what's happened in terms of the absence of virtue and in terms of how we raise up and train business leaders, those additional virtues are often missing. And so the framework in terms of what really matters often obscures the sorts of things that really lead to human flourishing locally that might undermine some growth projections, but it's good for people. And the question is whether or not business leaders, owners, managers have permission to make some of those trade-offs. I mean, this is the advantage of being an entrepreneur, is that if it's your own business, then you yourself have that freedom. If you are part of a multinational, you don't necessarily have that freedom unless the multinational has that embedded in their business model. So I think there's some real tensions with, these sort of large multinationals, the medium to small business, the sort of and the really really small businesses with 10 or less employees.
Yeah.
And in one sense, the small businesses are much more free to be advocates of human dignity and human flourishing and thriving.
And one of the big dangers that we're seeing on the horizon is because of the hyper consolidation of banks, where a lot of the capital flows to support these businesses. These banks that you would have found in communities have all been gobbled up. And so having a sub $10 billion assets and management bank, which is small, is really hard to find because those are the bankers that are willing to look at a credit score, willing to consider alternative considerations in the decision making. But as those get consolidated into the big conglomerates, it makes it very difficult for those local businesses. And so then it gets back to economics, get back to controlling the poor, and it's really concerning on a connection and a community on a local level. So,
during Jim Crow and the Black community, in those communities that had Black-owned banks, for example, the bankers not only knew their customers, but they knew other people to whom their customers were accountable to in terms of references and credibility, right? So if you go in for a loan in 1955 in, say, Atlanta, or you need an insurance policy in Atlanta in 1955, you go to the sort of Black-owned, Black-run institution, but then that person also knows your pastor, also knows the high school, the principal of the school where your kids are attending, things like that. And so you can take greater risk on people because you not only know them, but you know people who know them, who can vouch for them. And those community banks, you're right, we sort of lost those. And because of that, particularly for those who are working class and below, they're the ones who benefited the most from having relationships with decision makers in those contexts. Now, it wasn't perfect, right? Because sometimes bad decisions were made because it was your cousin, who gave you the loan and you defaulted again. So it wasn't a perfect. However, you saw different externalities than you see today.
Well, and you look at there's business lending, but there's also personal lending. And you look at just the economic crisis in 2008, and you look at the staggering statistics on personal lending and how it basically dried up or became fee-based. And so there was a new business model that emerged in the 90s, 2000s, quietly in banks that has just continued to ensnare the poor and give them less and less opportunities as they look to build a future for themselves. So it's really, really a tragedy, I think, that needs to be addressed as we think about rebuilding families and addressing some of this criminalization that we see.
Sure. If you're working class and below, and you're only known by your credit score, you're at a profound disadvantage. And that's a part of the depersonalization, the dehumanization, the alienation that we've arrived at today, is that we see people according to numbers on spreadsheets, right? As opposed to seeing them as persons connected to other persons. Yep. And interdependent on other persons. And so your credit score becomes the thing that people tell you to protect at all costs, right? Yeah. You can't have bad credit. You can't have bad credit. Instead of wondering, well, what if we focused on people being virtuous humans and having morality and caring about their neighbor? Those are the sorts of things that also build your credit score, right? Yeah. And those reductions, as you said, have really not been advantageous to those who are in the working class communities or below.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on the end, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the work that you've done with the Galsworthy Fellowship. Maybe explain a little bit about it, what it is, maybe some of the things that have come out of it. And I think you've been running it for a couple of years now. And then I think to round it out, why do you think it's important that we continue to invest in the research of solutions around mass incarceration, rebuilding of families, as you've kind of talked about?
So the Galsworthy program is something that I run here in New York at the King's College, and it's intended to introduce scholars to the range of issues that are related and connected to mass incarceration. And I wanted to do this in part for scholars because they're the ones who teach undergraduate students, and those undergraduate students are the ones who end up often being decision makers and influencers and leveraging assets, both socially and otherwise, in the marketplace, right? So I want people to sort of understand the range of issues, particularly if they are in decision-making positions, and to introduce these scholars to what's happening on the ground. So it's really divided in two sectors. On the one hand, let's read the data, see what it actually says. And then let's actually talk to practitioners and see what practitioners are doing on the ground and see where the gap is in what the data's saying and what institutions are doing and what communities actually need. And how can new scholarship really address the real gaps and real issues that people see. So I'm an advocate of people really studying this issue closely. It's highly complicated, highly layered. You can't really be a generalist on this, like healthcare, for example. It's just really complicated. Lots and lots of layers there. But if you get the data wrong, if you get the story wrong, you get the solutions wrong. A large part of my work is helping people get the story right as possible, to not focus on just one strain like the drug war, but also focus on race and class and poverty and geography and the family. Because insofar as we're able to see all of the variables that matter, all of the variables that make a contribution to this problem, guess what? We can be extremely creative with solutions. Right? The more variables, the more solutions. The more solutions that we see, the more people we can draw into making a contribution to making this thing better. So one of the things I tell audiences is that when you look at all of the variables that affect why people are criminally deviant, there is not a single vocation in the marketplace that can't make a contribution to keeping somebody from having that first interaction with the police. School teacher, school nurse, bus driver, postal worker, a business owner, doctor, lawyer. Everybody can do what they can in their own lane, in their own sphere, to humanize someone in such a way that can make them whole and keep them whole. And insofar as people believe themselves to be whole persons, they're less likely to find themselves breaking the social contract and being criminally deviant. Everybody has an opportunity to humanize someone else, to love them, to care about them, to invest in them. And that's how we solve this problem, sort of all hands on deck, and not leave it just to the professionals. I'm saying we're all professionals in this area and can really do a lot of good things. And entrepreneurs, just want to do a plug for that. Entrepreneurs in particular are probably among the most important, because they're the ones that have the creativity to provide the economic opportunities that really form and stabilize and maintain families. So they are the ones that often are overlooked, but I believe they're actually, if not, well, not only among the most important, maybe I could say the most important variable in undermining all these things is their freedom and creativity and opportunity to create sustainable employment for people in their local communities.
If you didn't pick up on it in this interview, Anthony and I have been friends for years, and he's a go-to source for me on so many issues. Also, if you're not following him on Twitter, drop whatever you're doing now and follow him. You will not be disappointed. Also, to dive deeper into this conversation, check out his book, Ending Overcriminalization and Mass Incarceration, Hope from Civil Society. Again, if you like what you've heard, drop us a review, subscribe, and stay tuned for next week's episode. Check out our work at accessventures.org. I'm Bryce Butler. Thanks for listening.